In July of 1971, Louis Armstrong died at home in Corona, Queens. He was 69 years old. He had been in poor health for months, heart trouble, kidney trouble, the accumulated weight of a life that had been lived professionally at an intensity that did not leave much room for careful self-preservation. The house in Corona was the home he had shared with his wife, Lucille Wilson Armstrong, for the last 25 years of his life. It was a modest house on a modest street, not the estate that a man of Armstrong's fame and income might have been expected to acquire, but the house he had chosen, the house he had been comfortable in, the house where he could be himself without the specific effort that being Louis Armstrong in public required of him. In the weeks after his death, Lucille began the process of going through what he had left behind: the instruments, the photographs, the correspondence, the practical and personal accumulation of a life. In the den, she found the tapes, not a few tapes, not a musician's working archive of rehearsals and performances. Hundreds of reels, stacked on shelves and stored in boxes, covering years of recording that Armstrong had done privately in the house, on the home reel-to-reel machine he had kept running in the den for as long as anyone could remember. She had known about some of them. Armstrong had been recording at home for years. This was known to the people close to him. But the volume was not fully known. The scope of what he had accumulated over 20 years of a man who turned on his tape recorder the way other people turned on the radio was not something anyone had fully reckoned with until the shelves were in front of you. What was on them was not what anyone expected. What the tapes contained, in the portion that researchers and archivists eventually were able to catalog, was a portrait of Louis Armstrong that the public record did not fully show. Not a contradictory portrait, not a revelation that the public Armstrong had been a performance concealing an entirely different private man, but a more complete one. On the tapes, Armstrong talked about music the way musicians talk about music when they are not explaining it to an interviewer. Specifically, technically, with the particular pleasure of someone discussing something they love in the full vocabulary of someone who has spent a lifetime inside it. He talked about other musicians, with admiration, with analysis, with the occasional needle of a man who had been in the room for 50 years and had formed specific opinions. He talked about his own recordings with the critical attention of a musician who listened to himself and found things to be satisfied with and things that could have been better. He talked about race and America in the language of a man who had navigated what needed to be navigated across a long career that began in New Orleans in the 1910s and moved through Chicago and New York and the international world of the mid-20th century. Not with the careful management of his public statements on these subjects, which tended toward a certain diplomacy, a certain awareness that what he said publicly would be read in a particular way, but with the directness of a man speaking to a machine that had no agenda. He talked about Lucille, about the house, about New Orleans and the people he had grown up with and the ones who were gone, about what it had been like to be young in a city that was unlike anywhere else, and what it had meant to leave, and what New Orleans had meant from a distance across the decades. And he played music. Not performances, not recordings designed to be recordings, but the specific music of a musician alone with an instrument and no audience, practicing, exploring, following a phrase to see where it went, returning to something he had played before and trying it at a different tempo or in a different key. The music on the tapes had the quality of a conversation with himself, the kind of conversation that is only possible when there is no one else in the room. He had been narrating his own life for 20 years. The public record had captured the performances. The tapes had captured the man between them. The house in Corona was different from the professional world Armstrong moved through. Corona, Queens, was a working neighborhood, Italian and Puerto Rican and black families, small businesses, churches, the ordinary life of a city neighborhood that had no particular relationship to the jazz world or the entertainment industry or the specific geography of Louis Armstrong's fame. Armstrong had chosen it deliberately. He had been offered larger houses in more prominent locations. He had declined. The Corona house was where he could be, as much as possible, not Louis Armstrong the public figure, but Louis Armstrong the person, the man who liked to cook red beans and rice, who enjoyed working in the garden in the back, who kept a den that was his own private territory. The den was where the tape machine lived. Armstrong had acquired a home reel-to-reel recorder sometime in the 1950s, and from that point forward, he used it with the specific dedication of a man who has found an instrument that suits something in his temperament exactly. He recorded music, his own playing, the radio, records he admired. He recorded conversations with Lucille, with musicians who came to the house, with friends. He recorded himself talking, narrating, reflecting, joking, telling the same stories he told everywhere, but with the specific relaxation of a man who is talking to a tape recorder rather than to a room full of people. He labeled the tapes himself, not systematically. The labels ranged from precise to approximate to barely legible, and the organizational logic was Armstrong's own rather than anyone else's. But he had kept them. He had not thrown them away. He had accumulated them across 2 decades with the specific diligence of a man who understood, at some level, that what he was recording was worth keeping. The question that the tapes opened, when Lucille found them in the summer of 1971, was the question that private recordings always open. What did he talk about when nobody was listening? The answer was more complicated and more human than the public figure suggested. The tapes were preserved after Armstrong's death and eventually became the foundation of the Louis Armstrong Archives at Queens College, which houses his personal and professional papers. Researchers who have worked with the tapes describe the experience of listening to them as being specifically different from studying the public record. Not because the man on the tapes is unrecognizable as the man in the performances, but because the register is different. The posture is different. The specific quality of a person who is not performing is different from the quality of a person who is. The Louis Armstrong House Museum in Corona, Queens, opened to the public in 2003. The house has been preserved largely as it was during Armstrong's lifetime. The kitchen where he cooked, the den where the tape machine sat, the bedroom where he died. Visitors come from across the country and from around the world. Many of them come expecting the museum of a famous musician. What the house gives them is something more particular, the home of a specific person, with the specific quality of a place that was genuinely lived in. What the tapes reveal, taken together, is that Armstrong understood his own life as something worth documenting. Not as an act of vanity. The tapes were private, not intended for public consumption, not organized for any audience beyond Armstrong himself, but as an act of attention, the act of a man who found his own experience, day by day and year by year, worth recording. This is not the quality of a man who was simply an entertainer. An entertainer performs for the audience. What Armstrong was doing in the den in Corona, Queens, with the reel-to-reel running and no audience in the room, was something more private and more essential. He was paying attention to his own life. In July of 1971, Lucille Armstrong found hundreds of hours of tape in the den of the Corona house. Nobody had known the full scope of what was there. Armstrong had been recording his own life for 20 years with no audience in mind. He labeled them himself. He kept them. He knew they were worth keeping.